Yes, all right.
Okay, that's fine. So I'd also like to thank the symposium organisers, particularly Lamia, for inviting me to the conference. I'm so pleased to be here. And also very glad to have received one of the prettiest conference packs I think I've ever had. So thank you very much indeed. And today I'm going to talk about assessment, technology assessment and language learning. And yes, most of what I'm going to say is actually taken from the book that James mentioned, Technology Enhanced Language Learning, Connecting Theory and Practice. And I'm going to give a broad overview of some of the questions about technology assessment and language learning. So, the first thing, I've got a boat. It's not just because we're beside the sea, but because when, as you know, when a boat is moving, it creates something called backwash, and that's what assessment does. So, I don't feel comfortable standing behind this podium. There isn't very much I can do about it. There's a relationship between the curriculum and the assessment and assessment, and it isn't always a comfortable one. Because whilst we know that in principle, assessment should be derived from the curriculum, that we should decide what we need to teach, and then that's what we should assess. In practice, all too often, we find ourselves in a situation where it's the assessment that drives the curriculum. This is particularly the case when the assessment is determined by somebody outside our teaching. So where people are, for example, in the context where I work, we decide on our own curriculum and our own assessment, and the two things fit very well together. But where you're working towards external examination systems and external assessments, then however much you want to determine your curriculum by what you think your students need, you're also going to be working towards making sure that they know what's going to be in the examination. And we need our students to pass the examinations. It doesn't do anything for our reputation if they don't. But at the same time, if somebody says that you're teaching to the test, that's not exactly a compliment on your teaching. So we need to think about how the curriculum and the assessment work together. And this is something that is very important for us as teachers, and it isn't always something that's in our control. So what is assessment for? Why do we have assessments for students? What's the purpose of assessment? So we have various kinds of assessment types. We have placement tests where we need to decide where a student, which group, which class, which level a student is going to be taught in. And these are usually internal, and so they don't need to be entirely accurate because we can move students around. If we find that the test gave a misleading result, we can move the students. So these are things that don't need to be, we want them to be fairly reliable. We don't want to be moving students a lot. But they don't need to be 100% perfect. And obviously these assessment purposes that I have in this list, they're not mutually exclusive. We sometimes use one test for many purposes. We have diagnostic assessments. These might take place during a placement test. They might be the same thing as the placement test, and we just use the results to see what students need to know. Or sometimes we use them independently. So a diagnostic assessment is to find out what it is that students need to learn. We're trying to get a picture of the students' knowledge and skills so that we can create a curriculum that fits the needs of the learners. These, again, we want these to be accurate, but it's not a high stakes thing. It doesn't matter if the student gets a low score. We may not even bother to score a student in a diagnostic test, because the purpose of this is purely to find out what the student needs to learn. We have proficiency tests, which are intended to find out what level a student has attained, and these may often be the same as achievement tests. But we're trying to give a student a score for their ability, and sometimes this really does matter. So when you think about the Cambridge English tests, for example, those matter. If a student's taking one of those exams, they need to do well. And those sorts of tests do need to be accurate, because if we're sending a student out saying that they have, I don't know, a 10 out of 10 level for English, then we need to make sure that that is actually true, that the test does measure their level of English. It needs to be valid, and it needs to measure their English, and it needs to be reliable, in that a student taking the test should get the same score pretty much every time they take it, unless obviously they improve. We have formative assessment. This is something that we as teachers do all the time informally. We're continually assessing their students to see how well they're doing on the course, to see what they need to do next in order to give them feedback so that they can improve. The whole of the assessment for learning, I'm going to call it a movement actually, because I think it's a movement or a philosophy, is based on the principle of continuous formative assessment, which is always fed back to the learner. And the idea of assessment for learning is that the learners should be self-regulated. So they do continuous formative assessments, they get the feedback, and then they know what it is that they need to learn next. And these do need to be fairly accurate, but again, it's not the end of the world if they're not always 100% reliable. But when we have summative assessment, which judges what a student is, where a student is at the end of the course, it's the end of a piece of work that students are doing, we give them an assessment to see how well they've learned, or possibly to see how well we've taught. And we want those to be accurate. And the reason I'm talking about this need for accuracy and where we need it and where we don't is because if we're going to think about using technology for assessment, sometimes technology can produce highly accurate results, and sometimes it doesn't. So we need to think about, well, where do we need to have this level of accuracy? We have achievement testing. That's what we get at the end of degree courses, for example, where we can say the student has achieved this level on this course, and that's it. And that needs to be good, because we need to be able to say with confidence that this student has a first-class degree, they have a lower second degree, whatever it is. We need to have confidence in that result. And the other reason for testing is accountability. We get quite a lot of this. I don't know in your context to what extent you have accountability testing, but we get quite a lot of it in the UK, especially in our school system. And the results of things like our public GCSE examinations, for example, are also used to rank schools and say how good schools and teachers are. And this, of course, is a problem in that the examinations were not designed for that purpose. Our public GCSE examinations are designed for achievement testing, and yet they're used also for accountability testing. So we have various reasons for testing students. They're quite complex, and as I said, some assessments may be used for multiple purposes. So why would we want to use technology in the assessment process? Well, there are several reasons, and I've given each one a question mark, actually, because I don't want you to go away thinking using technology for assessment is more efficient. That's what Aisha said, so it must be true. It's more efficient, it's cheaper. In some cases, it may be cheaper, quicker, easier, or more efficient. In some cases, it's not. It depends on the purpose of your assessment. assessment. So sometimes, for example, for your placement and diagnostic testing, then you can sometimes use multiple choice, online, on-screen, multiple choice tests. They will be quick to administer. Once you've written them, you can reuse them any number of times. And you don't need, if they're multiple choice tests, you don't need people to mark them. That's fine, because these are not high-stakes tests. They're internal. They're to get the students into the right group, to find out what the students' learning needs are. So you can use technology-aided assessments that are quick, that are easy to administer, and they'll be cheap to run, because once the tests are written, you don't need staff to keep rewriting the tests. With internal tests, as I said, it doesn't matter if they're not entirely accurate. There's not much motivation for students to cheat. Generally speaking, students want to be in the right class, so it doesn't matter if they know, if the questions get known in advance. But for big public assessments, where the stakes are high, then technology-aided assessment is not necessarily going to be cheaper or easier. It may sometimes be more efficient. So when you have computer-aided marking, then it may miss things that people miss. We have computer-aided marking in the TOEFL writing test, for example, but it's only done in conjunction with human markers. So the technology can pick up certain aspects of writing. It can see whether students have used the right kind of words. It can check students' spelling. It can't tell whether a student has made a coherent argument or not. You need a person to do that. So TOEFL is a high-stakes test, but it still needs human involvement in order to determine whether a student... What happened? Okay, some magic happened far away. Let's just remember that technology is not 100% reliable. And I'm just glad that so far, fingers crossed, touch wood, my slides are working. So, the problem with the cheaper, easier, more efficient argument is that it's something that's very appealing to institutions and to governments. These are people that tend to think that if we use technology with everything, it makes it cheaper and it makes it more efficient, and you can do large-scale testing. Cheaply. I was involved in a project that was evaluating a high-stakes test that was going to be introduced for all Year 9 learners, that's aged 13 to 14, in the UK. The project aimed to test the students' ICT skills. The government spent millions of pounds on this test, which was intended to be rolled out to all students in 2008. They thought that millions of pounds of investment would pay off because they wouldn't need to have to spend more money on markers each year to deal with the work. In fact, they didn't implement the test in the end. They decided not to go with it. It wasn't a good use of money in the end. It wasn't actually more efficient. It was extremely expensive to develop. They found that schools didn't have the infrastructure they needed to implement the test consistently.
So if you're going to do large-scale testing using technology, you need to make sure that the infrastructure is in place. And that is very expensive, and they didn't do that. So not all schools had sufficient computers to test 120 children at the same time. Not all schools had a good enough broadband connection, and this was in the UK. So it may look on the surface as though it's going to be cheaper or more efficient, but when we get down to the detail, that may not be the case. Certain types of technology-based assessments certainly can do things that paper and people-based testing can't do. So one example of that is we use, for example, Turnitin, which is it checks students' work. Has anybody come across Turnitin? No, it's a little course in UK universities and other places. It's actually an American program. But it checks students' written work against a database. I just want to make sure that this doesn't think I've forgotten it and go to sleep. This is something that people can't do. You need big computer systems to do this. And it throws up a similarity percentage. So it says X% of this work is similar to other documents. That is something that people can't do easily. It does have problems associated with it, which I'm going to talk about later. But that is an example of where technology can do something that you can't do without it. Also, adaptive testing, which is part of the assessment for learning philosophy, is something that is difficult for people to do. It's possible. You can give your students a test that fits their levels on an individual, person-by-person basis, but most of us are teaching large groups of students. We can't possibly write. I don't know how many students you have in your classes typically? Up to 600. You can't do 600 individual tests so that each student gets a test that's suited to their level. But with computer adaptive testing, then you can give the students tests at their level that are responsive to the student. And for certain types of students, that can be a very effective mechanism for learning, because with adaptive testing and adaptive tutoring, the student is given a test that fits their level. They're then given a piece of work to work on for learning, and then they're given another test to assess whether or not they've learnt it. And all of this can be automated so that it is individualised to the student. It doesn't work for all students, but for certain types of special needs students, this can be very effective. Is it more reliable? Well, in some cases it is more reliable. So where you've got banks of questions, as long as your questions are valid, that is to say as long as they test what they're intended to test, then the test will be fairly reliable because you'll get the same result each time. But I think one of the most important reasons for including technology in your assessment process is that it's part of everyday communication. So these are the things that I've been doing this morning. It's only about 9:30, but already I've checked Twitter, I've read the news on The Guardian, I've checked my email, I've had a look at Facebook. These are... Oops. Sorry, I'm just having a little bit of trouble here with the technology, of course, as you know. Right. Nowadays, new technologies are essential parts of communication. I don't know, how many of you, could I just have a show of hands, how many of you have used some sort of technological, digital communication this morning? Okay, and in the last 24 hours? Pretty much everybody. I'm not too keen on the term digital literacy, and I'll explain why in a moment, but our digital communications are important sites of literacy. We use them for reading and writing. There are social conventions associated with these tools, and they have forms of language which I call digalects associated with these sites of communication. So it's part of our everyday life. And I do think that as language teachers, we need to be teaching students to use these forms, to be literate in these settings. We need to teach them what sorts of language are commonly used and what the social conventions are. I think James showed us some examples yesterday of emails he'd received from students, and one of those was written in sort of text speak. And the problem with that was that the student was using language which was inappropriate to that context. And as teachers, we need to make sure that our teachers know, that our students know how to write when they're Facebooking or tweeting, but they also need to know how to write when they're writing business emails. Because actually, increasingly, we don't write business letters, we write business emails, and students need to know the conventions of that sort of genre. And if they're not in the assessment, this is where my first diagram came in, if they're not in the assessment, it's very hard to get them into the curriculum because of the backwash that assessment creates. So I prefer to talk about digital competence rather than digital literacy. I think that, as I said, digital tools provide sites for literacy, but I think that digital literacy as a term is actually quite misleading, because literacy fundamentally is about reading and creating. So when we talk about things like emotional literacy, we're actually talking about understanding reading emotions. So I think that we need to talk about digital competence, and in the book about technology-enhanced language learning, we propose a model of digital competence, and I think many of you will recognise that this is drawn from Canali and Swain's model of communicative competence, which was published in 1980. And we identify 4 areas of digital competence. So procedural competence is simply the matter of knowing, how the things work and which buttons to press. But the others, particularly socio-digital competence and digital discourse competence, are about language as well as about being able to use the tools. So when we talk about people being digitally literate, we're a bit confused about whether that means knowing what buttons to press or knowing what language to use. And socio-digital competence is about knowing which tools to use in a particular social context and knowing how to use them, what sort of things to say. So if you're Facebooking, well, do you use Facebook to contact your tutor? Would you use Facebook to email would you Facebook James to ask about PhD opportunities under his supervision? And I think the answer is probably no. And when you do contact James, having chosen the appropriate tool, what language do you use? And the answer, of course, is that you should be using formal business language. I totally agree, by the way, with James that there are cultural questions about what constitutes appropriate business language, but that's another matter. Digital discourse competence is about being able to manage extended tasks using technology. So in a way, that's what I'm doing here, and I've used a variety of tools in order to plan and deliver this presentation. And it's not just the Prezi that I'm using, but also the tools that I use to make the notes, and the creation of the Prezi, and now the delivery. It's an extended task, and it might use several different digital tools that I need to work with together, and there may be different types of language involved along the way. And then strategic competence is about being able to repair mistakes and work around mistakes. So I'm not going to go into that at the moment. But it's these two quadrants, socio-digital competence and digital discourse competence, where language and digital tools, digital technologies are intertwined. And we need to see both of those together in our assessments for the digital, assessment for the digital age. I should have used that as my title. That's a pretty cool title, isn't it? I'm going backwards. You can see here a sort of slight gap in my digital discourse competence. Okay.
Gives us another chance to enjoy the...
I hope I'm not making you feel seasick. I know I started with a boat, but I really wasn't intending to make you feel sick. I allow students to submit their assignments by Prezi, actually. They can create their assignments using Prezi. And some of them get a bit enthusiastic about the zoom and the transitions. And I'm trying to read their essays, which are equivalent to 6,000 words of essay. And I start to feel a bit... So I said that I would mention the assessment process. And basically, we've got several stages in the whole process of assessment. And at any point of these, you may decide to use technology. So it might be part of setting the challenge if you've got a bank of questions that you can, well, obviously you can't really use them to write the questions, but once you've written the questions, you can randomise them to the student. The students can do the task using digital tools, and that happens in the university where we work. Almost all non-examination assessments use digital tools, so we use them for writing essays. I said that they can do them on Prezi. The student submits their work online, it goes through Turnitin, but the work can be either marked by, it can be marked electronically, or it can be marked by people, or as in the case of TOEFL, it can involve both. Generally speaking, it's people who make the judgment, but sometimes that process itself is automated, and then the student needs to get feedback, and then finally the results need to be stored. The feedback that we give to students, in my context, is written by people and delivered by email or other electronic means. But it may not be, it may be sent in the post, it may be, or it may be entirely automated, the student's given a score. And so, so there are various different ways that technology may be used at every stage of the assignment. But as I said, I think that the most important reason for incorporating technology into our assessments is to enable those digital communicative competences to become part of the curriculum. However, we do need to be cautious. We don't want to go overboard with digital assessments without thinking through the consequences. So they can be extremely expensive to develop, and we need to make sure that that's going to be money well spent. you can end up testing what's easy to test. So it's very easy to design digital assessments to test things like grammar and vocabulary, where there are clear right and wrong answers. That can be appealing because it's easy, it can be automated, it is quicker, it is more efficient to do that. But we don't want to test just what's easy. We can't use easy tests to determine whether a student can carry out an extended piece of writing or a verbal presentation. There's no easy way to test that. So we need to make sure that we don't fall into the trap if our institution or our government says you need to make your testing electronic, that we don't fall into the trap of just testing what's easy. There's a very big risk that digital assessment will fossilise the curriculum. This is because of this assessment curriculum loop, and if you've spent a lot of money on developing expensive digital tests, then you're not going to want to spend a lot of money changing them in a hurry. So the tests that I mentioned earlier, the tests for the Key Stage 3 students that I was involved in evaluating, those were due to be rolled out to the entire UK school population in 2008. They were based on an interface that looked very similar to Office, Microsoft Office. And at the time that the assessment agency started working on the tests, the version of Office in use was Office 2003. It was designed to assess students' capability with using things like Office tools. But the thing is that by 2008, the Office interface had changed completely. We now had the ribbon interface. It was out of date. One of the big risks if those tests hadn't been abandoned was that it would have really fossilised the curriculum. It was too difficult, too expensive to change the test. We'd have had to have continued to teach students to use an outdated product so that they would be able to do the assessment. Tope gave us a good example of a fossilised curriculum yesterday when you talked about the Nigerian curriculum saying that students should be able to recognise the mouse. It actually is quite possible that students will come into school, even in the UK, will come into school at the age of 5 not able to recognise a mouse, not because they haven't had exposure to digital tools, but because they're using touch screens at home. So if we have a test which requires students to recognise a mouse, then that means that we have to teach them to recognise a mouse, even though they may never need to use them. Some people, by the way, call this a saber-tooth curriculum. It's sort of, you teach students how to keep themselves safe from saber-toothed tigers, even though they've been extinct for a number of years. And finally, there is a risk of producing, well, I'm going to call them false positives, but they can be false negatives as well, false or misleading results. And our use of Turnitin is a good example of that. So Turnitin checks for similarity. It produces a score, a percentage score for the student. It doesn't necessarily mean that the student has actually committed plagiarism or malpractice. We have to go beyond the score to find out what's happened. And even where there is similarity, it still may not indicate that a student is cheated. So that's all I wanted to say. I think that might leave us a little bit of time for questions.
Thank you very much. Yes, we were a couple of minutes